going to call this meeting, the study session to order. Study session for Tuesday, September 3rd, 2024. Can we get a roll call, please?
Commissioner Richards. Alderperson Denham.
Here.
Commissioner Green.
Here.
Commissioner Hillis.
Here.
Chairperson Groman.
Here.
Vice Chairperson Dieger.
Here.
Commissioner Morrell. Commissioner Martinowski.
Here.
Commissioner O'Day. Commissioner Gore. Don't believe we need a quorum, but we have one anyway.
Thank you. If you join me, we'll stand and say the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Tonight's item for study session will be a presentation from the staff pertaining to annexation. Would staff like to provide information on this item?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Commissioners, for your time this evening. This study session is intended to provide education and foster discussion. Tonight's presentation will cover Annexation 101, including state-mandated guidelines, requirements, and various types of annexation. Please note, we will not be discussing any specific properties tonight. Our goal is to educate this commission and stakeholders tonight with future plans to offer opportunities for stakeholder and public feedback in the near future. We encourage those interested to sign up before you leave so we can keep you informed about ongoing annexation discussions and decision-making. Your feedback and input are invaluable to us. At this time, I will hand the floor over to Nikki, who has taken the lead on this project and has done an outstanding job. We are eager to move forward with updating our annexation process.
Thank you, Commissioners. Welcome to Annexation 101, Learning the Boundaries, and we're going to focus on Chapter 94-34 of the Branson Municipal Code. So there's a few things we want to consider when we annex. There's going to be benefits to both the property owner and benefits to the city, but anytime we annex, that should be a mutually beneficial decision. So when we're talking about the property owner, they're usually looking for water, access to sanitary sewer, or services provided by the city, such as police and fire. As far as the city, there are benefits to annexing properties. One of them is providing uniform police and fire services, as well as the ISO rating. The Insurance Service Office creates ratings for fire departments, and by annexing properties, sometimes that can increase that rating. That can also negatively affect the rating, so that's something we want to look at. We also want to, annex in to have uniform land use, zoning regulations, reduce nonconformities, as well as expansion. So when we expand, that increases our eligibility for block grants and federal assistance to meet the needs of the city, as well as border clarification. So our current code is simply one sentence. Any territory annexed to the city shall be zoned A, agricultural, until it's changed as provided in this chapter, unless otherwise indicated in the annexation plan of intent. And with a lot of different municipalities, their code can be rather lengthy, and it can also be simply one sentence, just as this is. A lot of it just falls back to the revised statutes of Missouri. So sometimes it's, do we want to codify and change our code, or do we want to look at internal procedures? And that's something we'll have to consider. So in addition to our annexation code, we also have changing in zoning districts or rezoning. The one thing to take upon this is it's created by ordinance, which means, of course, it would come to the Planning and Zoning Commission first to see if you want to recommend approval, and then it moves forward to the Board of Aldermen. It would be presented to the Board of Aldermen as a public hearing, and then it would come back on their consent agenda. There's two ways to rezone a property. The first one is changes by the board, which means it can be initiated by the city or by the Board of Aldermen. And that's basically to amend the district boundaries. The one thing you want to take away from this is if there is a protest against rezoning, and it's acknowledged by 30% or more, the amendment shall not be passed unless it's by 2/3 vote of the board. Oh, wrong direction. We can also rezone by individuals. So this is basically, any landowner that's contiguous to city property and they want to annex in, they can apply for an annexation. They can apply to have their property rezoned. So as far as the cost of annexation, you'll find that in Appendix A of our fee schedule. Any annexation, there's 2 steps. You have the annexation of the property as well as the zoning change application. Again, our code currently states it'll come in as agricultural. A lot of times those properties need to be rezoned to match neighboring properties. Perhaps they need to be rezoned to community commercial for business purposes.
Excuse me, Nikki?
Yes.
If we have questions, can we ask them as you're going along, or do we got to remember them till the end and hope we remember them all?
I guess you can try to ask. I'll try to have an answer for you if I can.
Okay.
Do you have any questions right now?
Yeah, I have one. You said we had a simple code for as far as annexation goes. Then we get into rezoning. But before that, you said a lot of it can be handled either by code or by procedures.
Yes.
How do you feel about handling it by code so that everybody knows what the rules are beforehand rather than procedures that have to be explained to somebody?
We can definitely amend the code so it's a little more elaborate, and a lot of cities do have certain steps and procedures built into their code. But again, it falls back on the revised statutes. So if Missouri were to change their code or their policy on annexations, or perhaps, the city of Branson, we are a 4th-class city. If for any reason we were to become a charter city, obviously we would have to amend our code. If we don't get too detailed, then it just falls back on the revised statutes and we don't have to do the amendment. So it's just a matter of preference.
Okay, then you mentioned rezoning in conjunction with the annexation. Could you elaborate a little bit on that? We're here for annexation, but obviously you wouldn't be talking about rezoning if it didn't apply, could you?
Yes. So the way our code reads right now is anytime we annex a property, it comes in as agricultural. Okay. But we have in Chapter 94, our table of permitted uses. So depending on the zoning district, you're going to have certain things that you can do on that property and other things that are not permitted. So we want to make sure that the zoning matches the intent of the applicant and the property as well as the surrounding, neighboring properties. So we don't want to go in and perhaps, annex something agricultural all in a low-density residential district or all in a community commercial district. We're going to have to come back and amend that zoning.
Thank you. Any commissioners have any questions before we move on in this area?
Yes. So we're discussing just the voluntary annexation because to date, the city of Branson has never had an involuntary annexation.
So we'll cover both voluntary and involuntary annexation because they are called out in the revised statutes. I want to make sure everybody on the commission, as well as the Board of Aldermen and the rest of the city, know both procedures and how that applies to our city. Because then if we do decide to update the code or revise it, we want to make sure we're working within the guidelines of the state.
Okay, yeah, because with just the single sentence in our code, and the words plan of intent used, a plan of intent is never used with a voluntary, it's used with involuntary, which we have never had, and that requires a election. So, yeah, I think we're going to need further explanation in our code.
We'll go into detail. So, in general, the way we currently operate, we've got a few requirements for any type of annexation, and this would be on a voluntary annexation. The applicant would come in and they would apply through CitizenServe for a zoning change or an annexation. We would have a public hearing with the Planning Commission in which you would go ahead and either recommend approval or denial. The applicant can then move forward to the Board of Aldermen in which they would have a public hearing, and then they would have the following meeting, it would be on their consent agenda. It sounds relatively simple, but once we go into the revised statutes, it gets a little more complicated. So we're going to go ahead, just like Ruth had mentioned, and we're going to talk about landowner-initiated annexation as well as municipal-initiated annexation, otherwise known as involuntary annexation. But let's go ahead and start with the landowner-initiated annexation first. The one thing you want to make sure of, both for the landowner and the municipal, is the property has to be contiguous and compact to the existing boundaries. With the landowner-initiated annexation, it's relatively simple. They have to request that annexation in writing. It has to be notarized, and the territory, again, has to be contiguous and compact to the existing corporate limits.
What does compact mean in this term?
So the way it means in this instance is not necessarily compact as in tiny. It means we can't go for that land grab and that outward expansion. It has to slowly build to increase the corporate limits. So it has to be contiguous.
Thank you.
Excuse me, I had a question too.
Sure.
In the past, just a thought, in the past, annexation petitions came through the Planning and Development Department, and then they were forwarded on to the Board of to admin for the city administrator to review and present to the board. However, providing it first to the Planning and Development Department gave the Planning and Development Department the opportunity to discuss at that time with the applicant, you know, just what's kind of like one of your meetings that you hold to find out what's on the property, what do you want to do with the property, so it gives them the opportunity to submit a zoning application at the same time as well, because you know, it could be finalized after the property's annexed. Can't zone a property before it's annexed. Is that still taking place?
So we do have the open for business available for applicants, and I would suggest any type of new annexation coming in that they do have a pre-application meeting. Currently, I would say in the past year, we haven't had any annexations come through. Internally, we have changed the policy slightly. When somebody applies or somebody's interested in an annexation, we reach out to the various departments within the city to figure out how that annexation would affect their department. And we try to get feedback from all of the departments. Then we go back to the applicant and we say, hey, it looks like this might be a good fit, or hey, there's some reservations, you're free to move forward with this, but we want to let you know this is the way we're looking right now. It may not be mutually beneficial.
Right, but what I'm asking specifically is when a request to present a petition for annexation comes in, does the Planning and Development Department, are you notified immediately that that's taking place so you can work through it at the same time, or is it sometimes it's provided to administration? I know we haven't had one in a while. Is it provided to administration and then maybe there's a gap there to where time goes by and you aren't notified?
Sure. I
Not
mean,
this current, I'm not talking about this current administration, but
right, and that may have happened in the past, I'm not sure, but for us in the Planning and Development Department, the initial application is when they apply through Citizen Serve. So that's a flag to us that it has come in, the clock starts ticking, we make sure we have all the information from the applicant and move forward with the process.
good, thank you, that answered my question.
Okay, wonderful. So going back to the landowner-initiated annexation, it's a relatively simple process. It seems pretty cut and dry. Duties of the municipality. So again, we have our public hearing with the Planning Commission. We also have our public hearing with the Board of Aldermen. It's pretty simple except when there's an objection. So if within 14 days of the public hearing, if 5% of the registered voters from the municipality or 2 registered voters from the area to be annexed dispute the annexation, then we have to comply with the requirements of Section 7115 as amended by House Bill 1110 or 1980. This is very similar to the municipal-initiated annexation, which we are going to talk about right now. So the municipal-initiated annexation is a lengthy process. There's a lot involved. It's a lot of time. It's a lot of resources. The first thing we need to do is adopt the resolution of intent to annex. That's done with the Planning Commission. Then we prepare the plan of intent. So again, as Ruth mentioned, usually you only do the plan of intent when you have an involuntary annexation. However, if the voluntary annexation is disputed, we would still need a plan of intent if we want to move forward with that annexation. Then we have the introduction of the annexation ordinance. That's something the staff would draft, and we would hold a public hearing with the Board of Aldermen. Then they would go ahead and adopt the annexation ordinance. Then we need to obtain a declaratory judgment. That is done through the circuit courts. After that, we would have an election, and this is only for third and fourth class cities. Branson is a fourth class city. Taney County is a first class county. Please keep that in mind as you move forward. If you continue to do research on other cities, there are going to be variances depending on the type of county, whether it's a charter county or a charter city, and the class. So you have to be very cognizant of that. So the plan of intent, I really do feel like this is something that should be done internally for any type of annexation, because it helps the city determine whether or not it's going to be beneficial, mutually beneficial for both parties. So the plan of intent, we're looking at major services provided by the city. That's police, fire, sewer, water. We're also looking at the service schedule. If we were to annex a property, we have 3 years to provide those services. So we have to provide that schedule. There's also an assessment of the taxes. We also have to discuss the proposed zoning, which again, if we have those pre-application meetings, we'll have an idea of what their intent is, what their development plans are, if the zoning's going to work, as well as an effective date of the annexation. And we can take up to 3 years to annex a property.
So this is, what you just went through was the involuntary annexation, and that's when the plan of intent comes in.
Correct.
Not with the voluntary.
Yes, the only time you would use the plan of intent is if a voluntary annexation has objection.
And then it becomes an involuntary, and which we've never had in the city of Branson.
Correct, correct. So I just wanted to give you an idea of what a plan of intent would look like. This is just a simple summary. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of departments to come up with all this information. You're figuring out where the funding's coming from, if there's any special assessments that need to be assessed. You're looking at the sewer lines, you're looking at the fire hydrants, you're looking at the roads, we're looking at the police protection, and how we are going to provide those services to any property we annex. Again, that's voluntary and involuntary. We need to provide those services.
Under this plan of intent, if we're annexing property that's part of another fire district or water district, is that a cost that we have to figure into this? Would that come in under this plan of intent?
It is my understanding that when we annex a property in that's serviced by another fire protection district, there is some type of payout, and I can't speak too much on that. I'm sure the fire department, and as we kind of go further into this, we can provide more information, but there is going to generally be a cost associated with that.
But this is where it would be, in the plan of intent? That would all be covered under this plan of intent?
Yes.
Thank you.
No, it's not. This is just for the involuntary.
Just for the involuntary. And I think Ruth stated it best, is when a voluntary is objected, then it becomes an involuntary.
And your timing is 3 years max.
Yes, 3 years for the annexation.
And if it's not annexed within that 3 years, then
No, the services, I
Are
think it
not.
gets a little confusing.
It's
with
subject to de-annexation. So an entity or a person can de-annex because they did not have the services made available within the 3 years.
okay, that was my question.
One of the things that you have to bear in mind is this is a 101 study session, and part of what Nikki is letting you know is that plan of intent has a basis in both ends. If you do a voluntary, we still need to look at, can we provide services? What are the costs of the services? How does this affect the taxes? That could be the momentum for someone to decide to do a voluntary annexation. So it helps. It's kind of a open for business idea because it's looking at holistically, how does this affect both property owner in what they can do and in what the city and what they can do. So that's why she was talking about it's good to have that plan of intent. You need to have that in place if you're serious about the annexation and the voluntary falls through. But it also is your overview, which is what we use as a guide with all of our zoning decision-making. And so it's probably something akin to that that would be a part of the process we developed for a voluntary.
And just for clarification, with the voluntary, the city provides services in a reasonable time, quote unquote. So there's really no commitment. It's like if you want to voluntarily annex, services may not be available. I mean, you've annexed the property, but however, with the involuntary, it's a 3-year. And the 3-year is, we will provide these services within that 3-year timeline.
But they can de-annex because you did not provide.
Yes, yes.
Thank you, Holly. So moving on, as we draft the annexation ordinance, there's a few things we need to consider. Obviously, we have to have a description of the area, the metes and bounds, the legal description. We need to show that the annexation is reasonable and necessary, and that's required for the declaratory judgment, which we'll talk about in a little bit. We also have to have a statement that our intent to provide services to the area. We have to have our public hearing and an effective date of the annexation. So when we're talking about the declaratory judgment, that goes through the circuit court. Again, we have to show that the annexation is reasonable and necessary to proper development of the city, and we have to furnish our normal municipal services. We can't pick and choose. Even if it's hard to connect to sewer, if we're annexing them in, we have to provide them those services. So when we're talking about reasonable and necessary, the burden of proof will always be on the city. Here's some general guidelines, and there's a long list of them, but perhaps path growth for future necessity. Maybe we need more residential areas and we don't have enough. Perhaps we're spilling over into the proposed area. Enforcement of our zoning ordinances. So perhaps we have a connection agreement and they are contiguous to the city and we want to annex them in because we've already provided those services. Enforcement of ordinances. So there's lots of ways to show that it's reasonable and necessary, but we have to do our homework if we annex in. So just to give you some other examples, Springfield, they are currently considering revising their annexation code as well. And if you do a little research on their website, it pretty much states all over that they will continue to emphasize voluntary annexations only. And just for your reference, Springfield is a constitutional charter. They go off of home rule and they're in a first-class county. So they're slightly different than us. Ozark, Missouri, they are a first-class county and a fourth-class municipality, so they are very similar to Branson. This is their current code. It's not much longer than ours. I think the only difference is that the zoning classification goes back to whatever the county zoned them as versus agricultural. So considerations for annexation, there's a lot to consider. We've got internal and external stakeholders. We need to make sure we're fostering those partnerships because it really is a partnership. We have to make sure we can provide those services. That's a cost to the city, but perhaps it will help with future growth. If there's any intergovernmental agreements, we need to have those in consideration. We need to look at our response time for police and fire. We don't want to annex anything that we cannot service. If there's payouts to cities, counties, example, for the fire department to kind of buy out those services. If there's any annexation agreements already in place. So a lot of this comes back to, are we going to extend our code, change our code? Are we going to strengthen our internal policy? Are we going to do both? These are all things to consider. So our external stakeholders, we're looking at residents, Taney County, Missouri American Water District number 3, schools, how can they handle an influx of population if we were to annex a large territory or development? Hospitals, are they able to provide the same services? There's multiple stakeholders involved, and I think as a city, it's our responsibility that we identify all of those prior to annexing any property. The internal stakeholders, when I say internal, I'm really talking about within the city of Branson, within our municipality. So we've got planning and development, utilities, engineering. They're looking at those roadways, whether or not those roadways are meet city code right now. Stormwater, public works, police, fire, finance. Finance is going to be huge to tell us whether or not, we can afford this annexation. Land concerns, again, we're looking at the current state of our utilities. Are they where they need to be? Or if we annex this in 5 years, are we going to have to replace the sewer line? The road conditions, are they public? Are they private? Do they come close to city standards? Are they going to need to be redone? Existing land use, we're dealing with a lot of nonconformities. So if we're taking something in, how are we going to handle those legal nonconformities? Natural resources, how's the water quality? Is that going to affect DNR? Is there a development plan, or are we just annexing something in blind? These are all considerations. I think the biggest thing we need to look for in the city is what our preference is. Do we want to work on outward expansion? Do we want to reduce our islands? Voluntary versus involuntary? A lot of that right now is captured in our 2030 plan. Which we are in the process of revising that comprehensive plan, so please keep that in mind. But currently, you can find this on our website. In the 2030 plan, it looks like they want to concentrate on development within the city, so we want to reduce the islands. We want to make sure we manage our growth as efficiently as possible. We want to make sure we can adequately service the existing residents. Currently, it might change, but at that time, we had 1,753 islands in the city of Branson. Some of those islands could be as small as a single condo unit. Others could be large territories. So the high priority right now is to annex those properties before focusing on new growth, and whether or not we want to actually start annexing right now or just keep it voluntary.
For those watching online, could you explain what an island is when you talk about islands?
Sure. So right now we've got the future land use map. Again, this is available online. If you look let's see if I can do this. There we go. So you can kind of identify the islands. They're white. So there's an island there. So anything that's not contiguous, well, they can be contiguous, but just little holes in our map. And again, some of these holes, there may be geographical boundaries where the land's not even, you can't even develop in the land, so is it even worth annexing in if nobody's going to be building? That's something that should be considered. Some areas, perhaps they're too large for us to service at this point in time. So right now, our goal is to review the voluntary annexation process. February 2025 is our goal. So right now, we want to have study sessions with the Board of Aldermen. We want stakeholder input. And we do want to create the process, whether it be a new ordinance, administrative regulation, or both. So our next meeting and our study session will be Tuesday, October 22nd at 4:30 with the Board of Aldermen. And if we have any residents or stakeholders that want to be more involved in the process, we have some sign-in sheets over at that table. Otherwise, you can call the Planning and Development Department or email us, and we'll get you on the email list to provide you with updated information and meeting dates. And that's it. Any questions?
Just want to thank you very much. It was a very thorough report, and I personally appreciate all the effort you folks go through. Makes our job a lot easier. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any questions from any commissioners? Then this concludes the study session for tonight. If you wish to stay up to date for future meetings and discussions pertaining to annexation, staff has created a form where you can provide your contact information and to stay in the loop. The next item on the agenda would be adjournment. Our next meeting is scheduled for this evening at 6 p.m. in the council chambers. I will now entertain a motion to adjourn the September 3rd, 2024 Planning Commission study session. Do I have a motion?
I'll make the motion.
Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Have a vote? Okay, we're done.
We don't have to have a roll call vote. We can just take an oral vote.
Okay.
All in favor, aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Abstaining? We are adjourned. And Chairperson Groman, we signed up everyone in the audience attending to participate as stakeholders.
Yep.